Welcome everyone to the first ever, the first of all time, whatever you want to call it, but the very first episode of the podcast on Private Podcast. Very meta. I know, this is JP Gooderham, the founder of Storyboard Podcasts. And if you're not familiar, Storyboard is a specialized service. It's a platform for companies and organizations to host private podcasts for their employees or their team members. And so what we've learned is that there are just so many different kinds of organizations who want to use private podcasting. And that ranges from huge companies all the way up to the Fortune 500, to startups, to nonprofits, academic institutions, healthcare systems. There's just a million different ways that companies today are looking to harness the power of audio and use podcasting as a way to better engage employees. And I should mention that Storyboard has been really growing. It's been very exciting to be a part of this team. And just this week, we crossed a milestone where we now have over 600 organizations using our different tiers on Storyboard. And the truth is, we've talked to a lot of them. We've had a lot of demos and client calls and emails. I think anyone who's listening who is a current Storyboard customer knows that we like to stay in touch. And I say that because you notice some themes start to emerge when you're doing those calls. And it's funny because all of you out there who've already started your first private podcast, you're really the pioneer almost certainly at your company in doing it. You're the first one. It's very rare to find a company that has a long history of podcasting. And what's really great about that is there's so much creativity and ingenuity that goes into this from the podcasters who are on the client side, and we learn so much in talking to them. So that gave us an idea. If there's a lot of these similar questions and we're all kind of going through the same process, wouldn't it be cool to really use the power of that community and have a podcast series where, whether you are a very experienced veteran podcaster or somebody who doesn't even know what kind of microphone you want to get, this podcast is for you. We are going to do a journey. Here's the vision. Let me lay out the vision here to start things off. We're going to lay out the journey that we would recommend that our companies and our clients take in launching a successful private podcast. We're going to start today with our very first episode. We have a terrific guest who's going to be coming on in a minute. The interview is excellent, and it's going to focus on why companies today are using podcasts to talk and engage their employees. We're going to start there, really at the very beginning of this process, and work our way through questions like, what decisions on equipment would we recommend? How do you start building out your launch strategy? How do you, after you've launched, sustain success? When you've made that podcast successful, how do you expand the scope of your vision where now you might have multiple podcasts running on Storyboard? So there's so many different topics we want to cover. And I think what's really exciting is we now have spoken to so many great people that we have a great arsenal of guests who are going to be coming on. You're going to want to be around for this podcast. Like I said, it's going to be a series. So we're going to be trying to publish these episodes every 2 weeks. If you want to make sure, you might be streaming this for the very first one, I would recommend subscribing on whatever your favorite podcast player is. Go in, look up the podcast on Private Podcasts. You can also find it in our Twitter feed and on our LinkedIn. Check those out. It would be great for you to be able to follow these episodes as they come out and learn more about the growing art of private podcasting and what so many successful companies have been doing with audio for their employees and for their teams. So now that we have that out of the way, very excited to have you here. Let's jump into our very first interview, and we're going to begin by discussing why companies today are embracing podcasting and private podcasting. All right, everyone, I'm extremely excited for our first ever guest. She is a terrific thought leader in the space. She's the director of Peppermint, a consultancy focusing on employee engagement. And I should also note that she has firsthand experience in podcasting as she hosts her own podcast, Be a Bigger Fish, which is excellent. And I cannot recommend highly enough. Her name is Debbie Aurelius. Debbie, how are you doing today?
I'm really good. Thank you. And that's such a kind introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, for anyone who is unfamiliar with your podcast, I've listened to it for a while. She speaks with a number of people who have such great expertise in internal communications. And I think what's really exciting about what you do is I feel like you're always looking for what's next and what are other ways that people can, work on engaging their employees. So let me ask you this. For someone who's unfamiliar with your work, can you talk a little bit about what you do and the way that you advise clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have enjoyed making podcast content for a number of years now, and that has developed on from an in house role I had with a large global organization. We had the challenge of not being able to reach all of our colleague groups synchronously. So we were spread over such a huge time zone that we couldn't get everyone together at one time to have a really good conversation. And so recorded content started to play a more important part in my role as an internal communicator. So it's been my absolute joy to help other people since I've started up as an independent consultant to find ways to communicate with their global workforce too, even if that means sometimes it has to be asynchronously and ideally through audio content. It just has so many advantages from an internal comms perspective that it really is a great medium for people to start using more.
Wow, you hit on a couple of key points there. And obviously this is our first episode. One thing that we often talk with our clients about when they first, write to us, they want to use Storyboard or they want to see what we're doing is we want to understand, what is their vision? And I think one of the really exciting things about podcasting, like you said, is that it's on demand and it really puts the listener in the driver's seat. But let me ask you this. I'm going to turn the tables from what I usually do, where, I, from the Storyboard team, am talking about all the value I see in podcasting. I want to ask you, there are so many different ways today that companies try to engage with employees. Email, video. There's so many different channels that are competing for people's attention. Why have you seen companies embrace podcasting? What has really driven the value there?
I think podcast content has some advantages that other channels don't have. So I wouldn't advocate putting all of your internal comms on a podcast because people generally need to consume content in a variety of different ways. But there is some content that lends itself to audio a lot better than other forms of media. So, for example, if you want to get deep into a topic that requires somebody to take some time to listen to it and absorb it, podcast content can be very helpful, and people will tend to stay listening to content for a lot longer than they're prepared to sit and watch content, for example. So people can listen to podcast content while they're doing something else. And quite commonly, that will be that they're on a commute. So they're on a train and they can listen with a headset rather than have to stand and watch a handset. Or they're walking the dog, or they're jogging, or they're doing day-to-day chores or simple work tasks, but it just gives them that time to be listening to content while they're doing something else. So that multitasking aspect is really, really advantageous. I also think that degree of personality that comes through in audio that can sometimes be missing from video. So we have certain expectations about in-house video, and they can sometimes look quite corporate and be a little bit constrained. And it's often a kind of talking head format video where somebody's sitting in their office, looking at the camera and talking, and it doesn't really convey personality in the same way that audio content can. So when you're capturing audio content with somebody in your organization who isn't necessarily adept at communicating, what you'll find is because the hardware involved is so light touch compared to making a video, they kind of forget to be self-conscious and they start to open up a little bit more because you're literally just capturing a conversation. It can be one person and another person having a human to human conversation. And capturing that human element is so much easier via audio, and it's so much more powerful to the listener. So most people listen to audio as an individual with a headset. It's a very intimate medium. And to hear dialogue that's authentic is much more powerful. It's much more resonant, using that medium. So it's a great place for that kind of human to human connection that so many organizations are desperately seeking.
The video point is very interesting to me. And I can say from experience, we work with a client. This is a company that's based in New York. And they were telling us that with video, they would go so far as if they're in a highly regulated industry, the information that they put out needs to be correct. That's of paramount importance. And so what would happen is if a new clinical trial came out or something like that, and they needed to make an edit, they would literally get everyone in the same clothes that they wore when they recorded the video and try to do edits that way. And it's a time intensive process. Like you said, it can be challenging to get people to open up. Being on camera is definitely a much more challenging thing for people who may have never done that before. Meanwhile, with audio, I think Debbie's podcast is a great example of this. She speaks with people globally. And while certainly you can create a very professional setup where you're doing in-house recording, where if we're in the same room and speaking to each other, we're recording from a set of microphones. But if you're not familiar with podcasting technology, it's quite easy nowadays to record using a service like Zoom or Skype or a number of other ones that are out there and have a conversation with somebody in a remote area. And it becomes so much more conversational, which is really exciting. And I think the same part of that too is it opens up so many doors. And this is one have been, we at this point, Storyboard launched in the fall of 2018. There's over 500 organizations who are using it, and they're using it for so many different reasons. But one of the ones that I did not anticipate as much when we started this project was watching companies talk to people and engage with people who maybe wouldn't have been interviewed before. Whether that's a company who's going out and interviewing top performers, and it's so easy now to get them on the phone and figure out what makes them successful and allow them to share their story. I think that's really exciting. That's been my experience, at least. Does that resonate, Debbie?
It absolutely does. Yeah, it's not just capturing the people who you would classically capture as part of your internal communications. So the senior leader, the head of department, that sort of thing. It's actually capturing the voices of people who are on the front line, who are dealing with customers and listening to their genuine sort of heartfelt experience of that, or capturing the thoughts of experts. So quite often the experts in an organization are kind of kept behind the scenes, even though everyone secretly feels like they're the people who really would have their finger on the pulse. So, coaxing those people to speak for themselves using audio, again, it's, a really powerful way for people to feel they're getting to the heart of a matter really quickly. So yeah, I think you're right. It's getting those previously unheard voices out into the open is one of the really powerful things about it.
I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting because many companies start with what I would describe as a more top-down approach where, and it makes sense, maybe this is recording somebody from the C-suite, like the CEO, doing a weekly update to the team or whatever it might be. But what we often find over time is that as that podcast effort really takes legs and finds success, the natural expansion path for many of our clients is what are other opportunities, just like Debbie said, where it is a very personal setting, you know what I mean, where you can really talk to somebody and have a conversation. And that's where it starts to really look and feel much like the traditional podcasts that are so popular, where it's interview style. And we have a few clients who they've become almost mini celebrities within their organization for doing that. And I find that quite exciting. But Debbie, let me ask you a question from talking to so many companies and different people in the space. One concern that I think any internal communication specialist has is that there's so many different things that are competing for the attention of employees today. The email inbox is always full. There are so many meetings. Why is it worthwhile to make the investment in podcasting as an additional channel? How do you see that conversation play out?
That's a really good point, and it's always a good tactic, I suppose, for an internal communicator to keep their eye on their strategy. So what is their internal communications there to achieve, and then look at the methods they're using to achieve that. So I wouldn't necessarily advocate bolting podcasts on just because it's the shiny new thing and you think it's trendy and it's going to impress somebody senior in your team. It's about listening to your people and finding out what information do they need to have, or what kind of messaging would they really love to listen to, what sort of things make them proud about working for your organization that they feel they don't get enough exposure to. And from the other side of the fence, what does the organization want to achieve? How does it want to improve its relationship with its people? And what would be the best way to do that? So it's really marrying those two things. What do your audience really want? What are they craving? What's missing out of their internal comms right now? And what does your organization really want to achieve? And how does building a better relationship with its people move that organization forwards? So once you're really clear about that, you can identify the sweet spot. What's the right place for audio content, and what's the best content to put on that channel? So, for example, you might find that you are in an organization with a vastly distributed workforce, like the one I was describing when I came on, where you're globally distributed. You can't all get together at the same time, but it's important that some information is shared to everybody equally. So audio content is a great way to make sure everyone can access that content on demand. Or you might find that lots of your workforce are working in situations where they can't access computers, laptops, screens, that sort of thing. So having content on a device that's much more portable is much more suitable to their working environment and suddenly opens up a world of internal comms information they hadn't previously felt that connected with because they don't have ready access to screens. So it's about identifying, what you're trying to achieve and what your workforce really needs and the kind of constraints that you're working with, the sort of business model you're working with, to find out exactly where audio fits.
I think the other part of that is as new podcasters build their vision, and I love the way you frame this. I think thinking about the listener and how we're trying to engage them is so important. We look at the data and it's very interesting because there are companies who may try to repurpose content that may have previously been used elsewhere. You know what I mean? Taking something that maybe would have been an e-learning and just trying to turn it into a podcast. And what we find is that tends to be less effective than, I'll give you an example. We see podcast episodes that are roughly the length of someone's commute to work. So in that kind of 20 to 45-minute range, that typically is the sweet spot of where we see the most engagement. And it makes complete sense where if a podcast is longer than, the drive or the train into work and I get to the end and I turn it off, it's going to become less likely that I come back and return to that piece of content. And so I think for podcasters, I love the idea of trying to build something that is really perfect for when that person is going to be listening to it. On the flip side, we do work with many clients who have remote teams. And some great examples of this are sales teams that constantly have people out in the field. We work with the logistics company who they have drivers and truckers who are constantly moving around. And it's quite rare that they're going to be sitting down at a desktop, but they still have a need to do training. And so the difference is instead of just taking a training and putting it on Storyboard, sitting down and doing a recording and thinking about how to make it an audio friendly format can be really helpful. Debbie, I know you were touching on this and I want to expand on this a little bit more. Probably my favorite question that we get to ask clients when they first reach out to Storyboard, and we always open with this, is what is your vision? What is the vision for how podcasting is going to work in your organization? You've mentioned a few great examples of how companies that you've advised and spoken to have used podcasting. What would you say is a hallmark of visions for podcasting that make them successful? What would you point to a new podcaster and say, this is kind of how to start constructing that vision?
Oh, that's a really good question. So it's a vision for the podcast itself.
Or the effort as a whole. So, someone has it's they've kind of taken that step of they've heard podcasting is really taking off. They can see the value in doing something really personal. Is there anything that jumps out to you about what, might be important for building that vision?
There's a couple of sides to it. There's the sort of concept of what you really want to achieve and why. Employee engagement is the way you introduce my organization, which is quite a good description for what I try to achieve. That's something that most organizations are trying to achieve is a sense of how they really get their people to feel part of something that they're proud to belong to, and that they really want to make their best effort to improve. So how can you engender that spirit using audio content? And that concept of people feeling like they belong is so important in internal communications. A sense of belonging is one of the real prerequisites for people to feel engaged with an organization. So how can you engender a sense of belonging amongst your workforce using audio content? And it really is about tapping into that power of intimacy, of human to human connection, and of sharing stories. So one of my guests on my podcast made a statement I thought was so good. I captured it as a kind of visual, which was the quickest way to get to know people is through a story. The quickest way to connect people is through a story. So it's finding those stories that really resonate with your workforce and that help them to feel like, yeah, I belong. I can kind of, I understand that. I can see where that person's coming from. That's how I feel too. Yeah, this is my tribe. This is where I belong. So it's, if you can capture a way to really encourage that using your podcast, I think that would be a brilliant vision for the podcast. How do I really engender a sense of belonging, a sense of value, a sense of worth around the workforce in my organization? That would be super. If you can then use a way to measure that, so you've got some metrics that show that that's happening too, that would be amazing. So whether that's listenership or the things that people do after they've listened to the podcast or the number of people who want to be involved in co-creating the podcast, those sorts of things, then that can help you Two, to demonstrate that your vision is not just something that's esoteric, it's actually something that's constructing a more robust and healthy organization. So I would say those two things would be a good way to start.
As a technology partner, I'm very excited about you bringing up the metrics piece of it. And obviously for people listening to this right now, you could be at various stages of your podcasting journey. For those of you who are Storyboard users, you're already very familiar with this, that we offer metrics that you have the ability to see how many people are listening, but also to engage more deeply and see how many of those listeners are reaching the end of an episode, which I think is a great way to get a sense of, is it content that's rich enough to really engage people all the way, or are we seeing drop-offs? I think another thing that I would add to Debbie's comment too, that's part of Storyboard, which I believe is unique to us and really isn't part of traditional podcasting. With every episode, your listeners have the ability to send in feedback that you as a podcaster can review. And it's actually, that feature started because my experience, at least as a podcaster, is that having it become more of a two-way street, where there's engagement and conversation and people can ask me questions and say, oh, that point that Debbie brought up was very, very interesting. What can we say more about that and how we create a vision? And that can be a great way to help jumpstart future content and future ways to engage with people. But the other thing that Debbie mentioned that I'm really enthusiastic about is this idea of, and this isn't true for every organization. You might be a team of 50 people right now where it really only makes sense to have one or two podcasters hosting. But especially for our larger organizations, we were meeting with a client in Atlanta here in the States a couple of weeks ago. And I love the way that this client framed this. They were talking about the idea that previously within their large company, they had what they called rogue podcasters or rogue communicators, where, somebody in one department is just like, I'll do this. And they might come out with kind of a scrappy or a hacky way to make that happen. And while there's a lot of ingenuity into doing that, it presents challenges. The communications team doesn't have the ability to see how it's working or develop those efforts or get the engagement stats. One of the call outs that I would do that we're really excited about here in February of 2020 is that we've recently launched our new feature, Groups in Storyboard, which actually allows you to have multiple podcasts running within an organization. And so I think a terrific barometer of success, especially for large organizations, is, you have your first hit. That first podcast is working. Are there other places? Does the sales team have the opportunity to run their own show where you're building up a host as part of that organization? So I really like that call out, Debbie. And I think that kind of evolution makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I love the fact that you mentioned the two-way aspect of it, because I think one of the things that concerns communicators about podcasting is it might seem like a broadcast channel that's one way, and that's not the kind of ethos that we're trying to engender here. So I love the fact that you've built in that ability for people to feedback. I think that's critical, and makes the whole podcast much more successful. But also that podcasting doesn't replace face-to-face conversation, and in fact, some podcasts give people something really meaty to talk about. So some interesting stats are published in the UK recently through a big podcasting company here, was that they found that 60% of people will listen to a podcast that somebody has spoken to them about, rather than a podcast that's got a 5-star review or is top of the charts on Apple or whatever. So it's that person-to-person conversation that sparks interest in the podcast itself in the first place. So it's really giving somebody content that's going to give them that water cooler moment that they can't wait to get to the water cooler to talk to their colleague about. Did you hear on that podcast that, so it really is a kind of catalyst for more community-minded dialogue and conversation and that sort of thing, rather than just being a pure broadcast channel. That's not what it's about.
If I was asked the question of, is there one recommendation you would give to drive engagement that I wouldn't expect, it would pretty much be that. It's so fascinating that for the organizations that feature more, and this doesn't have to be exclusively your strategy, but if it's part of it, I think it's so vital. The person-to-person conversations. I talked about the idea of a sales team that's going out and it's a fully remote team of people distributed across a country who virtually are never in the same place at the same time. That idea of doing an interview with Lisa and talking about what makes Lisa so successful and what her journey was to end up at this company and learning about someone. Number one, it's a type of content that you wouldn't get anywhere else. You're never going to frame that in an email format. It's very unlikely that you're going to do a video series like that. But in podcasting, those types of conversations are so common. And what's really neat is that this effect happens, just like Debbie said, where that will actually turn that person into an evangelist for your podcast. Because what will happen, and we see this in the stats, is that they email the rest of their team and they're like, it's a point of pride, to have been featured. And all of a sudden now you might have a team of 25 people who are highly engaged in that and understand the vision of what you're doing. So I think those person-to-person conversations are terrific. I wanted to ask Debbie, I was thinking about what are some potential outcomes that podcasters can be looking for. I think you've mentioned a couple of really key ones. We've talked about the idea of employee engagement. And by investing in a podcast platform, we see a lot of value because you actually get those statistics and can understand who's listening and for how long. We talked about the idea of building some personality of being able to tell a narrative or a story for a company. Are there any other big impacts or outcomes that come to mind for you from talking to podcasters?
I guess it depends what you choose to use them for. So you may use podcast content to support some campaigns that you feel are particularly critical to your organization. And if you do, then you can try to track the outcomes that happen from that. So say, for example, I heard an in-house podcast that was about people taking up certain financial benefits that they could access through their organization that weren't being taken up. And it sounds like a very dry subject, but they created this podcast that was really engaging because the podcast host asked 10 questions of the lady who was in charge of, this kind of benefit administration. And she didn't get all the questions right, but she was absolutely charming about it. And it was very funny. She took it really, really well. And it was a very funny piece of content to listen to. And I imagine for that organization, it completely broke down the barriers of people approaching this lady to talk about this subject because she was just so charming on the podcast. So if you could measure how many people access the service after listening to the podcast, that would give you a really critical metric about how influential that piece of content was in terms of encouraging people to take positive action. So it sounds very simple, but if you are using podcast content to align to something that's important to you, important to your organization, it's quite easy to track whether people take action after listening to the podcast and therefore kind of, proving the value of the podcast effectively. And you may be able to tie that into financial metrics, all sorts of things that will, demonstrate how valuable that channel is for you.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, and we'll talk about this. I think once that initial vision is really built out of, most companies have a few things they're trying to accomplish initially, but I think what they find is that podcasting can be used for so many different areas. That's a great one of promoting an internal initiative or an internal effort or a resource that people aren't aware of. Even taking something, we work with many clients who look at Storyboard, not just from telling an overall cultural story for the company, but also from a training perspective. I think the other thing you can do with audio is it can feel more personal and it can be more engaging and more interesting when done really well. And so I think from that perspective too, I was talking about this groups feature that we offer on Storyboard. What some of these companies have started to do is to build out different knowledge streams. And I'll just give an example that I really like. Previously, our app worked very similarly to virtually everyone, where you had one feed. And as you posted new episodes, your newest episodes might go to the top, but it's all in one feed. Now, because we have this group mechanism, you can think about it very much like a playlist. Your listeners can actually click on a group and look at a set of episodes that have been categorized. And what's so helpful about that from a technology perspective is one of our clients, I love this idea. They've recorded a 6-part new hire training where as part of their employee onboarding and when they're bringing on a new person to the company, they can give this podcast to them and say, this is part of your training. And it becomes something that immediately gives a voice. And I think that's a really effective way to continue building out the strategy. So Debbie, I want to ask you about that. If you're talking to a podcaster, I think the example you just used was terrific. But let's say a company has sort of accomplished their first goal. They've built a podcast that's been successful. Are there any things that you think about as what's the next step in evolving it? What comes next for a podcaster? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I love the idea of people being able to sort of cluster podcasts together in little playlists and that sort of thing. I think that's a great idea. And onboarding is a super example of where you can share content that people can listen to over and over and over again. So, you don't always pick up on something the first time you hear it. And just having that content accessible to you over and over again can sometimes be really, really helpful to your confidence. So, you can go back and listen again. So that's a really good example. In terms of making your podcasting more sophisticated, I guess if you can segment your audience and you can target content at different audience groups, that will make your content much more meaningful to those people, potentially. So that would be something that you could look to do maybe as a next step once you've got your podcast up and running, is really drill down into who's enjoying that type of content, where are they listening to it, when are they listening to it, what would enhance that experience, that sort of thing. And also maybe to think about improving certain aspects of working life that you may be focusing on. So at the moment, lots of people are concerned about things like sustainability, or they're concerned about things like mental health at work. How can you use your podcast, if it's an established channel, to really assist with big issues like those in your workplace? And the more people you can invite on to talk about things that may be seen as taboo in the organization, the more you can break through those taboos and those stereotypes and those sort of assumptions and get that conversation opened up inside your organization. So give everybody confidence to talk about them. In particularly, say, mental health at work, one of the big restricting factors is people's fear of having conversations around it, because they're not really sure what to say, what they can say, what they can't say. So the more of a conversation you can engender, maybe through your podcast to begin with, the more you can open up that topic area so people can feel confident to deal with it, face to face when they have those real conversations. So I guess there are a number of different ways you can take your podcast to make it more sophisticated or more complex. Once you've got comfortable with the sort of mechanics of making it and the places in which it's succeeding when you get going.
I think that's a phenomenal idea. And I think that there's a number of different sources you can find for those sorts of next efforts that you can add into your podcast ecosystem. And I think if you think about it in what you're building and what the overall vision is, if we're going from a starting point of, we want to be able to drive engagement and employee engagement and get people to feel very connected to this organization and succeed when they're here. I think part of that is finding opportunities to feature people who maybe it's a working group, you know what I mean? Who now this is a chance for them to do an episode or two and share their story and share what they've been working on. I think those are such phenomenal opportunities. So I could not agree more highly. Debbie, your insight has been excellent. I'm so happy that we had you on the podcast. I want to close with one question for you as a podcaster. One question or a concern that sometimes you get with an organization is when they're first looking at Storyboard, they're like, all right, this is a great technical solution for us. We're not totally sure on who the host is going to be. So my question to you is, do you have any guidance about what makes a good host? Who can be hosting? How do you kind of think about that?
So one of my recent guests spoke so highly of one of her hosts that I think that was a really good model. So she had found someone in her organization who had charisma and credibility already in the organization. So if you can find somebody with those two things, you're onto a winner. So if they've got that kind of big personality where they make everybody they speak to feel important, so when they're having real life conversations, they can really connect with anybody inside the organization at any level and give that person that same feeling that they're important, they're being listened to, and they're really communicating with somebody who cares about them. So if you can find someone with that level of charisma, but who also has credibility, so they're the sort of person people trust to have the organization's interest at heart to some extent as well as theirs, and to have their finger on the pulse in terms of what's going on in the organization. So if you've got anybody who fits that stereotype, I think they would be a really, really good host. Ironically, being a good listener is what makes somebody a really good podcast host, I think, because it gives them the capability to have those really genuine conversations where they're reacting naturally and they're really bringing the best out of the people that they're including in their podcast. And those are the sorts of conversations I think people really want to tune into. So that would be my advice.
Debbie, your insight was tremendous. We really appreciate your time and being the first ever podcast guest for this series. I think this was a great way to just give people some insight into how to think about vision. And I'm really excited that you led with so much vision related conversation. For anyone looking to find more about you or listen to your podcast, where can people find more about what you're doing?
So my website is called peppermintfish.com. So it's literally peppermintfish as you would normally spell it.com. You'll find all my podcast content is on there. And if you want to connect with me personally, I'm Debbie Aurelius on Twitter, which is where I do most of my online conversations. Or you can find us on Instagram at peppermintfishc. That's a curly cut at the end of peppermint fish for communications. So yeah, pretty easy to find online.
Thank you, Debbie.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm absolutely thrilled to have been invited. So really, thank you very much.
All right, folks, that is our show. I just want to give you a couple of closing notes before we finish this thing off here. First off, of course, big thanks to Debbie. She was excellent. We have a number of really great guests who are going to be on this podcast. So our second point would be make sure if you're streaming this for the first time that you're also subscribed so you see those future episodes. We're going to be really trying to take you through the full journey of launching and running and developing a private podcast for your organization. And we're going to be talking to podcast producers, some of the podcasters from our network who have done really terrific jobs at their company. There's just a number of really awesome people that we have to talk to. So this is going to be a fun podcast for anyone who's interested in this space. Of course, make sure that you're following us on social media. You can look us up, Storyboard Podcast on LinkedIn. You also can find us on Twitter at Try Storyboard. And finally, if you're not using Storyboard already and you want to learn more, get over to our website. It's at trystoryboard.com. Again, that's trystoryboard.com. We're pretty rare because we actually let you start with the free tier if you want to for up to 100 listeners, and it's totally free. You don't even have to put in a credit card. It's awesome. So if you've thought about doing this, you want to give it a shot, make sure to sign up there. But if you know you're ready to really go at this thing and you have a vision in mind, you can also sign up for a demo and we'll give you a full walkthrough of our product and why we're so excited about the future of private podcasting on Storyboard. Thank you, everyone, and have a great week.